I'm very grateful that JDW Weaver, who is one of the foremost Mennonite theologians that's working today, is willing to spend some time discussing his theology and his current thinking for our ALI class.
Well, thank you for asking me, Gerald. I'm always glad to talk about theology.
So, how did you get involved in writing Mennonite theology?
Well, it happened a long time ago. I went to graduate school to study Anabaptist history. And I got out of graduate school as a church historian, and like happens to lots of college professors at small liberal arts colleges, you have to teach stuff that you feel like you're not really prepared to do. And I was asked to teach a theology class. And I asked my colleagues, since it was at a Mennonite school, I asked my colleagues, is there a Mennonite way or a Mennonite perspective on these issues? And I thought they would send me to a couple articles that would lay it all out. And instead, my colleagues said, I don't know. And I've been trying to answer that question ever since. My career has been one version or another, a kind of a twisted, wiggly line, trying to answer the question of how Mennonites should be thinking about theology.
And you've been very prolific in your theological writings. I just make note of two books that you've published in recent years. One called The Nonviolent Atonement, and more recently a book called The Nonviolent God. But the article that that these ELI students have been reading was actually published back in the 1990s before you wrote these books. And in that article, you pointed out that Mennonites are not, haven't come to systematic theology, or they've come to systematic theology fairly recently. Can you talk a little bit about why it's taken this long for Mennonites to begin thinking about systematic theology or writing systematic theology?
I can speculate on that question. In the time of the Reformation, Mennonites did a little bit of thinking about theology, but there were several historical reasons that kind of pushed that out of their agenda. Persecution was one. Another side was that they wanted to talk more about Jesus than they did about systematic theology. We could push that. You could talk about that. That has to do with 16th century history. But Mennonites ended up living in fairly withdrawn, restricted rural areas, and they had also inherited a suspicion of formal theology, because it was the formal theology that reformers had used to condemn them. And so, for reasons both inside and outside of their experience, they ended up moving away from theology, and they lived for numbers of years, at least the kind of Swiss tradition that I came out of, just didn't do formal theology, university theology. And that was kind of the case until late in the 19th century, when Mennonites in North America started developing colleges. And that was just at the point when the modernist fundamentalist controversy became hot. And Mennonites, above all, knew they were biblical. And so they tended to side on the fundamentalist side of that discussion between fundamentalists and modernists. And fundamentalists said they rejected theology. They were just going to be biblical. And that kind of guided Mennonite thinking, that we didn't do theology, we did Bible. So even when Mennonites finally started a seminary, Goshen Biblical Seminary, in the mid-40s, it was definitely biblical, not theological. And so it took about, I don't know, the 1970s or 80s before we started to get comfortable actually talking about theology. And I just happened to fall into discussion about the time that became a serviceable idea, that we'd actually talk about theology.
So one of the things that you say in this essay is that we're reading in our class is that when Mennonites started doing theology, they tended to work from two lists, set of core doctrinal ideas that are shared with other Christians, and then Mennonite distinctives that are specific to being Mennonite. And you argue in this essay that really Mennonites ought to start with our distinctives and think about the core doctrines from the standpoint of those distinctives. Is that still the way that you think about how Mennonites ought to do theology?
No, I don't use that language or that formulation anymore. That was an early stage of my thinking. I got my mind changed very abruptly, or this would be when I mentioned a while ago that I've had several twists and turns. One of those turns came because after that, in response to that article, John Howard Yoder sent me a letter, and the first little paragraph of the letter, he congratulated the Gospel Herald for actually trying to do something intelligent, and he thanked me for my effort, saying that he knew I was trying to follow in his line of thinking, and he appreciated it. And then he spent almost 2 pages telling me what I had missed. And what I had missed was that each of the, this is a summary of a lot of complicated stuff that he wrote, but one of the important things that I had missed was that the various first lists that I described were all different, and behind them, each one of them had an assumption that the purveyors of this list were right and any other first lists were wrong, and I had to deal with what was behind each of the claims that there was a generic first list that everybody should be accepting. He also critiqued my idea that Mennonite theology should be distinct. If it's distinct, he said, that's a backhanded way to say whatever you're being distinct from is really the norm, and you don't want to let the other people define who you are by saying you're distinct over against that. We should be specific to something, and the thing that we should be specific to is Jesus. He didn't spell that out very far, but that was the beginning of me taking a somewhat different tack to how to do theology. And I think this book, The Nonviolent God, that Gerald held up a little bit ago, is my furthest statement so far. I don't know if there'll be another statement of doing theology that starts with the idea that we start with Jesus, take the narrative of Jesus, and theology develops from there. So theology is specific to Jesus rather than distinct from something else. So I'd say, that, and the path from that letter and my understanding from that isn't direct to the way I would articulate it now, but it set that course.
So you mentioned John Howard Yoder as a significant influence on your thinking. I'm wondering, and you just published a book called John Howard Yoder, Radical Theologian, which is about Yoder's legacy and particularly his theological methodology. I wonder how you as a theologian cope with the troubling recent revelations about the extent and persistence of his sexual misconduct. How do you deal with that as a theologian?
Well, we have to just face it head on and say that in spite of his theological influence, he also had this very troubling, wide-ranging problem, and we can't run away from that. That's the man, and we have to deal with both sides of that. I would say that his influence was to help me to understand that theology starts with Jesus. And so what I've inherited in a sentence, what I've inherited from John Yoder is not all of his positions. It's that methodology about where theology starts. And so he's a purveyor. And so in this book that Gerald just held up, the first long chapter that I wrote in there explains and shows how his own work demonstrated how theology comes out of Jesus. And so when I'm following something, I'm really picking up that methodology. But the methodology can stand now. It can stand on its own. Methodology can stand on its own. It doesn't. You don't have to cite John Yoder, but he was an important point in helping me understand that methodology. But 16th century Anabaptism is another historical moment when we can see that methodology coming into play, and we talk about it. There are others. There are others as well. So I learned a methodology from John, and one of the specific things you can learn from his the sorry side of his legacy is that starting with Jesus, claiming the theology that starts with Jesus isn't a guarantee of truth. You can make bad applications as well as good applications. I was just thinking this morning about a bad application. Some people want to claim Jesus' cleansing of the temple, pick up the idea of the whip, and there are people that claim that, oh, that's the justification for violence. And that's a claim that starts with Jesus, and I would reject that claim. I think whips make noise, and that's the way you herd animals. And Jesus was just getting those animals out of the temple because he didn't think they belonged there. And I don't think that's the basis for violent revolution. But people can make bad applications of Jesus as well as good applications of Jesus. And that one dimension of Yoder illustrates that.
So in the essay that we've read, Which Way Mennonite Theology, we're proposing a specific direction for Mennonite theology to take. How would you describe today the future of Mennonite theology? What are the important tasks for it to be doing at this point? What's next on the horizon? What needs to be done?
I recently worked with a graduate student with a dissertation that's recently finished, and he pointed out he developed a dimension of theology that I recognize I hadn't done, that Yoder hadn't done, that nobody has really done it. When you say that God is revealed in Jesus, most of what I've done is talk about Jesus, starting with that narrative. So you start Jesus' human experience on earth and develop theology about that. All of our theology has tended to focus on the earthly material dimensions. What does Jesus' rejection of the sword look like when we apply it? When we talk about the church that comes out of the gathered community around Jesus, see, that's the material, earthly aspect. But when we say God is in that, there's a cosmic dimension, and we've not thought very much about the cosmic dimension of saying that God is revealed in Jesus. So this dissertation that I was part of uses process theology to develop a cosmic dimension of saying that our theology comes out of Jesus, and our life as Christians is modeled on Jesus. And so now, I think, and using process theology is one way to develop a cosmic dimension, but like we understand that always theology that comes from Jesus is always contingent, there would be other ways to develop cosmic dimensions as well. And I think that's one important dimension that we can develop in the future.
Do you think Mennonites are more receptive to theological work and theological writing now than they were back when you first wrote that essay in the 1990s?
Well, I think some Mennonites are. I think the Mennonites in the academy, in the academic world are, and that's it's easy to see in that we're talking about it. And the periodical, the Conrad Gable Review, has lots of articles on that, and they have 2 call for papers out right now that deal with Mennonite systematic theology. So I think, at least in the academy, for the academic people, I think there is much more interest in theology than there used to be. I don't know. I don't think that's filtered down very far into the people who just sit in the pew on Sunday morning, although there is more, because periodically I do get an invitation to go to a church and talk about the issues of violence in theology. So I think there is more understanding, more interest than there used to be, but I still don't think it's, my sense is, with very little sample, that it's still not widespread in the for people in the pew.
In our class, of course, we are educators, and the students in this class are people who teach at Mennonite schools, elementary and high schools. Should they be concerned about Mennonite theology? Is there a responsibility at that level to purvey Anabaptist theology to young people?
Oh, absolutely. I think theology is how we define who we are. We're starting to come from all kinds of different ethnicities and different backgrounds, and a theology that starts with Jesus and makes visible what Jesus is about. I think, that's theology, and that's what defines us as Christians. And so I think theology is more important now than it's ever been, or should be more important now than it's ever been as defining who we are as a Peace Church.
Well, on behalf of our class, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us from your experience and thinking and knowledge about theology this morning.
Well, thank you, Gerald. It was a pleasure.
Okay.